The flames roared like a furious beast, devouring the mansion perched on the snow-covered hill in Whitehaven. The inferno lit up the night sky, casting an orange glow over the pristine white snow. The once grand estate was now a chaotic battlefield of fire and ash. Firefighters shouted to each other, their commands drowned out by the relentless crackling of flames and the howling winter wind. "There's still someone inside," a firefighter yelled, pointing toward a shattered window on the second floor. His words were almost lost beneath the thunderous collapse of a section of the roof. The team moved quickly. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with smoke and heat. The walls, once adorned with elegant paintings, were now charred and crumbling. Beams hung precariously, groaning under the weight of the fire's fury. Every step was a gamble against the collapsing structure. "Over here," another firefighter called out, spotting a figure lying motionless on the floor of what had been the grand living room. Henry's body was partially covered in debris, his face streaked with soot, his clothes singed from the heat. His breaths were shallow, his chest barely rising. Two firefighters rushed to him. "Grab his arms, quick!" one shouted. They worked in tandem, lifting his limp form with care but urgency. Around them, the fire roared louder as if protesting their rescue. "He's heavy. Move!" the second firefighter urged, clearing a path through the wreckage. The heat was unbearable, beads of sweat forming instantly on their brows despite the frigid air outside. The ceiling above them groaned ominously as they emerged from the blazing ruins. A blast of icy wind hit them, a cruel reminder of the freezing temperatures beyond the fire's reach. The stark cold bit into their skin, but they pressed on, laying Henry down on the snow-covered ground. His lifeless body seemed to blend with the pale surroundings, except for the soot and ash that clung to him. "Check his pulse," a paramedic demanded, rushing over with a kit in hand. "He's alive," one of the firefighters confirmed, relief flooding his voice. But barely. Henry was quickly placed on a stretcher. His clothes were soaked from the water sprayed by the fire hoses, and steam rose faintly from his body as the warmth met the freezing air. His lips moved faintly, forming barely audible words. "Clara, Andrew," he murmured, the names slipping out like fragments of a dream. "What did he say?" a paramedic asked, leaning closer. "Something about Clara and Andrew," one firefighter replied, exchanging a glance with his partner. "Family, maybe." The ambulance doors slammed shut as the vehicle sped off, its tires skidding slightly on the icy driveway. Behind it, the mansion groaned under the fire's relentless assault. Moments later, a thunderous crash echoed across the hill as the roof gave way completely, sending sparks shooting into the night sky. The house, once a symbol of Henry's wealth and stability, was reduced to nothing but glowing embers and a skeletal frame. As the ambulance disappeared into the snowy darkness, the scene grew eerily quiet, save for the occasional crackle of dying flames. The snow continued to fall, slowly blanketing the ruins, as if trying to erase the memory of the destruction. Inside the speeding ambulance, the paramedics worked diligently to stabilize Henry. His pulse was faint, but steady enough to give them hope. Yet, his whispered words lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the lives that might still be lost within the inferno. When Henry opened his eyes, the sterile brightness of the hospital room pierced through the haze clouding his mind. He squinted against the harsh light, his head pounding as if someone had driven nails into his skull. Every part of his body ached, weighed down by an invisible force that made even breathing feel like a battle. The rhythmic beeping of heart monitors echoed in the background, steady and impersonal. It was the only sound in the room, apart from the faint murmur of voices from the hallway. For a moment, Henry let himself drift in the stillness, his mind clinging to the fragile comfort of not knowing. A sharp voice pulled him back. "Mr. Henry, can you hear me?" A figure in a white coat hovered over him, the lines of concern etched deeply into the doctor's face. "Yes," Henry croaked, his throat dry and raspy. He tried to sit up, but a searing pain shot through his ribs, forcing him back against the pillows. Where am I?" "You're at Whitehaven Medical. You were pulled from a house fire. You've been unconscious for hours," the doctor explained, his tone measured and careful. Henry's brow furrowed as fragments of the night surfaced in his mind. The flames, the heat, the screams. His chest tightened. "My wife, Clara, and my son, Andrew," he whispered. His voice cracking. "Where are they?" The doctor hesitated, his expression darkening. He pulled a chair closer, his movements deliberate, as if trying to brace Henry for what was coming. "Mr. Henry," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of tragedy. "You're safe now, but I'm deeply sorry to tell you that your wife and son didn't make it." The words struck Henry like a hammer to the chest. His breath hitched, and for a moment he thought he might faint again. "No," he murmured, shaking his head weakly. "No, that's not possible. He was right there. We found you in the living room," the doctor continued gently. "Your wife's remains were recovered near the stairs. As for your son, the fire was intense. We weren't able to recover him." The room spun around Henry, his vision blurring. He clutched the edge of the blanket, his knuckles white with tension. It felt as though the walls were closing in on him, the air thick and suffocating. "Andrew can't be gone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's my boy. He played the piano last night. He was smiling." Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away, desperate to hold on to anything that felt real. Memories crashed over him like a wave, sharp and jagged. Clara laughing softly as she poured him a glass of wine, her eyes glowing in the firelight. Andrew's fingers dancing across the piano keys, filling the room with the melody they called Song of Home. It was a lullaby Henry had composed years ago, a piece that belonged to their family and no one else. The images burned brighter in his mind, only to be replaced by the roar of the fire, the suffocating smoke, and the devastating sound of Andrew's panicked voice shouting his name. His hands trembled as the weight of it all crushed him. "I don't remember how I got out," Henry admitted hoarsely. His eyes flickered toward the window, where snow drifted gently outside, a stark contrast to the inferno that had consumed his life. "Why did I survive?" The doctor placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "You were lucky, the firefighters found you just in time. But you need to rest now. Your body has been through a great deal." Rest. The word felt foreign, almost cruel. How could he rest when everything that mattered had been ripped away? He turned his face toward the wall, his tears finally spilling over. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, each sound a cruel reminder that his heart was still beating while those of his loved ones were not. In the quiet of that sterile room, Henry knew that something was missing. Not just his family, but a part of himself, a part that had been left behind in the ashes of his home. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the crushing pain, but it was there, relentless and unyielding, reminding him that his life would never be the same. Time passed like an endless fog for Henry. 10 long years since the fire, and he still lived alone in the reconstructed mansion on the hill in Whitehaven. The house was every bit as grand as it had been before, with its sweeping staircases and ornate chandeliers, yet it felt hollow, devoid of warmth or life. It was a monument to loss rather than a place of comfort. Andrew's piano remained in its rightful spot in the music room, untouched since the fire. A heavy cover of dark fabric draped over it, protecting the polished wood from dust, but also from Henry's gaze. He couldn't bear to look at it. To him, it wasn't just an instrument, it was a relic of a past life. A reminder of the son who would never play it again. For a decade, Henry existed rather than lived. His days were a blur of solitude and routine, broken only by his charitable donations to orphanages, schools, and hospitals. It was his way of honoring Clara and Andrew, of trying to find some meaning in the void they left behind. But no matter how much he gave, the emptiness persisted, gnawing at his soul. Winter descended on Whitehaven once more, and with it came Henry's annual visit to the local orphanage. He arrived as he always did, in a long black coat that shielded him from the biting cold. Snowflakes clung to his grey hair as he climbed the steps to the modest brick building. The air smelled of pine and frost, a stark reminder of the season he had come to dread. Inside, the warmth of the orphanage greeted him, a sharp contrast to the chill outside. The sound of children laughing and playing filled the air, their voices bouncing off the faded yellow walls. Henry moved slowly through the hallways, his cane tapping softly on the wooden floor. His visits were usually brief. He would speak with the staff, deliver his donations, and leave. He preferred to keep his distance, reluctant to let himself feel too much. But something stopped him that day. A sound, a melody. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the chatter of children, but as Henry focused, his heart skipped a beat. It was unmistakable. The song of home, the very melody he had composed for Andrew all those years ago, fragile, imperfect, but undeniably the same. His legs felt like lead as he followed the sound, his heart racing in his chest. It led him to a small room at the end of the hallway, where a boy sat on the floor. The child, no older than 10 or 11, played absent-mindedly with a wooden toy car. He was humming the tune, his voice soft and slightly off-key, but full of innocence. Henry stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. It was as though time had folded in on itself, dragging him back to those nights when Andrew had played the piano, filling their home with the same melody. "Excuse me," Henry finally managed, his voice hoarse. The boy looked up, startled by the interruption. His large, curious eyes met Henry's, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. "How do you know that song?" Henry asked, his tone urgent but gentle. The boy blinked, tilting his head slightly. "I don't know," he said, his voice small. "I just sing it sometimes. I always have." Henry felt the floor tilt beneath him. He stepped closer, his cane tapping against the floor as he tried to steady himself. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lucas," the boy replied. "Why, did I do something wrong?" "No," Henry said quickly, shaking his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." Lucas looked at him with a mix of curiosity and caution, his small hands gripping the toy car. "It's just a song. I don't even know where I heard it." But Henry knew he didn't understand how it was possible. But he knew that song wasn't just a song, it was a thread connecting him to the life he thought he had lost forever. Lucas. The name lingered in Henry's mind long after their first meeting. The boy had an air of familiarity that Henry couldn't shake. An echo of someone he had loved and lost. It wasn't just the melody Lucas hummed, though that alone was haunting enough. It was the way he furrowed his brow when he was deep in thought, the way his small fingers tapped rhythmically on his knees. The resemblance to Andrew was uncanny, almost too much to be a coincidence. Henry began visiting the orphanage more frequently. What had once been an annual ritual turned into weekly stops, each one giving him an excuse to spend time with Lucas. The boy seemed shy at first, watching Henry with cautious eyes, but over time, he began to open up. They played simple games together, checkers, cards, and Henry always found himself marveling at how easily Lucas's laugh filled the room. It was light, unrestrained, and carried a warmth Henry hadn't felt in years, yet beneath the growing bond, questions gnawed at Henry. How could a boy he had never met know the song of home? How could he share so many mannerisms with Andrew? As though carrying pieces of him in his small frame, the possibility was impossible. But the feeling persisted, like a thread pulling him toward answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. One day, Henry approached the orphanage director, a kind but firm woman named Mrs. Greer. She was busy sorting paperwork when Henry knocked lightly on her office door. "Mr. Whitaker," she greeted him with a polite smile. "What brings you in today?" "I wanted to ask you about Lucas," Henry said, his tone careful. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but now that he was here, the words felt heavier. "I've gotten to know him a bit and, well, I can't help but feel there's something special about him." Mrs. Greer nodded thoughtfully. "Lucas is a remarkable boy, quiet but very bright. He's been with us for a long time." "How long exactly?" Henry pressed, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "He came to us when he was about 4, she replied. "A woman found him near the train station one winter night. He was alone, cold, clutching a small blue blanket." Henry's breath caught. "A blue blanket," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mrs. Greer confirmed, frowning slightly. "It was unusual. Had little musical notes embroidered on the edges. Beautiful work, really. We kept it for him. It's in his things, though I'm not sure he knows much about it." Henry's heart pounded. Clara had embroidered a blanket just like that for Andrew when he was a baby, stitching tiny notes along the edges as a nod to the music that filled their home. The coincidence was too great to ignore. "May I see it?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Mrs. Greer hesitated. "I'm not sure it's appropriate to go through Lucas's belongings without his consent," she said carefully. "He's quite protective of the few things he has." Henry nodded, swallowing his frustration. "Of course, I understand." When he returned to the main room, he found Lucas sitting cross-legged on the floor, piecing together a small jigsaw puzzle. The boy looked up and smiled when he saw Henry, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that made Henry's chest ache. "Hey, Mr. Whitaker," Lucas said, waving a hand casually. "Lucas," Henry began, crouching down to his level. "Can I ask you something? Do you have a blue blanket, one with music notes on it?" Lucas's expression shifted, his brow furrowing as if trying to recall something distant. "Yeah," he said slowly. "It's in my drawer. I don't use it much, but it's mine." "Why?" Henry's hands trembled as he reached out to touch the boy's shoulder. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Do you know where it came from?" Lucas shook his head. "No, I've had it as long as I can remember, I think. I think the lady who brought me here gave it to me. She said it was special." "Special?" The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Henry sat back, his mind racing. The connection between Lucas and his family grew stronger with every passing moment, but he needed more answers. He needed certainty. Henry could hardly contain his nerves as he drove Lucas to the mansion. Snow blanketed the winding road, the landscape serene in its wintry stillness. A stark contrast to the storm brewing in his mind. Beside him, Lucas sat quietly, clutching his blue blanket. The boy seemed at ease, but Henry's heart was a tempest. He hadn't allowed anyone into his home in years, let alone a child who carried so many echoes of the past. When they arrived, Henry paused at the grand doors of the house. "This is where I live," he said softly, glancing at Lucas. "It might feel big and empty, but I hope you'll feel welcome." Lucas nodded, his wide eyes taking in the towering mansion. "It's like a castle," he said with a small smile, his breath fogging the cold air. Inside, the house was as Henry had left it, pristine. But lifeless, the furniture stood as if untouched, and silence reigned in every corner. Lucas followed Henry into the parlor, his footsteps hesitant until they stopped in front of the piano. The heavy fabric that had concealed it for a decade remained in place, a shroud for memories Henry had buried deep. "What's under there?" Lucas asked, pointing at the covered piano. Henry hesitated. His hand hovered over the fabric for a moment before he pulled it away, revealing the glossy surface beneath. "This is a piano," he said, his voice low. "It hasn't been played in a long time." Lucas's gaze locked onto the instrument as if it held some unspoken secret. "Can I hear it?" Henry sat on the bench, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. He hadn't touched the piano since Andrew had played his final note. Taking a deep breath, he pressed down on the familiar keys, and the song of home filled the room. As the melody flowed, Lucas's humming began almost instinctively. The boy's voice was soft, but this time words emerged, fragments of phrases that Andrew used to sing. The sound was hauntingly familiar, as though Andrew himself had been brought back to life in those fleeting moments. Henry's hands froze on the keys. He turned to Lucas, his eyes brimming with tears. "Where did you learn those words?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Lucas replied, his small shoulders shrugging. "They're just in my head." Henry's chest tightened. He felt the tears spill over, unable to hold them back. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore, this was real. This boy wasn't simply connected to his son, he was a part of him. Determined to uncover the truth, Henry arranged for a DNA test the following morning. The wait for the results was agonizing, each hour dragging like an eternity. When the envelope finally arrived, Henry sat at his desk, staring at it for what felt like forever. With trembling hands, he opened it. The truth hit him like a wave, both devastating and exhilarating. Lucas was his grandson. Andrew had survived the fire, only to lose his memory and disappear. Years later, he had a son, Lucas. Before passing away under circumstances Henry couldn't yet understand. Henry's tears fell freely as he folded the letter. He glanced at Lucas, who was in the next room playing with Max, the old shepherd dog who had taken to the boy instantly. Despite the heartbreak of Andrew's loss, Henry felt a flicker of something he hadn't known in years: hope. He stood and walked into the room where Lucas sat. The boy looked up at him, his face lit with a smile. "What's wrong, Mr. Whitaker?" Henry knelt before him, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Nothing's wrong," he said, his voice soft but steady. I'm glad you're here." Lucas tilted his head, confused but pleased. "Me too." For the first time in a decade, the mansion felt alive. The music of the past was no longer a haunting memory, it was a bridge to the future. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the mansion, casting a golden hue over the polished floors. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. Laughter echoed faintly from the parlor, where Lucas played with Max, the old shepherd who had taken to the boy as though he'd been waiting for him all along. Henry stood in the doorway, watching them. The weight he had carried for a decade no longer felt so crushing. Lucas's presence had filled the mansion with warmth, something Henry had thought impossible. He adjusted his tie, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he stepped into the room. "Breakfast is ready," Henry announced, his voice softer than it had been in years. Lucas looked up, his face glowing with joy. "Can Max come too?" he asked, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "Of course," Henry replied with a chuckle, "but only if he promises not to eat all the bacon." They gathered at the long dining table, which had once seemed so intimidatingly large in its emptiness. Lucas devoured his pancakes with the appetite of a growing boy, while Henry sipped his coffee, content to listen to the chatter that filled the room. It was a simple morning, but for Henry, it was extraordinary. After breakfast, Henry led Lucas back to the music room. The piano, once silent and covered in dust, now gleamed in the morning light. Henry sat on the bench and beckoned Lucas to join him. The boy hesitated, then climbed up beside him, his legs dangling as he stared at the keys. "Do you want to try?" Henry asked gently. Lucas shook his head. "I don't know how." "That's all right," Henry said. He placed Lucas's hands on the keys, guiding his fingers with care. "Let's start with something simple." Together they played a few hesitant notes. The sound was uneven, but it was music nonetheless. Lucas giggled as he pressed a wrong key, and Henry laughed along with him. It was the first time the piano had brought him joy in over a decade. "You know," Henry began, his tone serious but kind, "this was your father's favorite place. He loved this piano." Lucas's smile faded slightly as he looked up at Henry. "Do you think he'd be proud of me?" Henry felt his throat tighten. He placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "He would be more than proud. He'd be the happiest man alive to see you here." The boy nodded, his expression softening as he returned his focus to the keys. Together, they played the first few bars of the Song of Home, the melody filling the room not with sorrow, but with hope. In the weeks that followed, Henry finalized the adoption paperwork. Lucas Whitaker was now officially his grandson, a part of his family in every way that mattered. They began to rebuild the mansion together, not the structure itself, but the life within it. The once silent halls now rang with the sound of Lucas's laughter, the bark of Max as he chased after him, and the faint strains of music that drifted from the piano. The mansion was no longer a place of mourning. It had become a home once again. On a snowy evening, as they sat by the fireplace with Max curled at their feet, Lucas looked up at Henry. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Henry asked, raising an eyebrow. "For finding me," Lucas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry's eyes misted as he pulled the boy into a hug. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for bringing me back to life." And as the snow fell gently outside, Henry knew that he had been given a second chance, not just to love, but to live. The music of their lives played on, not as a lament for what was lost, but as a celebration of what they had found. Please leave a like and a comment